Would you like to have the ability to shoot handheld at really high ISO settings with little to no noise? Stay with me. Okay, so you're out during that great post-sunset blue hour time. You see a great image in front of you. Now, of course, you want to set down a tripod since your exposures are going to be measured in seconds or minutes. But sometimes it's not easy to set down a tripod. Your location may be too crowded. There may be rules against setting down a tripod where you happen to find yourself, or maybe you just forgot to bring it along. Your only choice here, other than giving up and going home, is to handhold your camera. But that means cranking up the ISO and suffering the noise that goes along with that. Now, Lightroom has a truly industrial strength set of sharpening and noise reduction tools. And even quite high ISO settings, when used properly, these tools are all you really need. And we cover sharpening and noise reduction along with the rest of the powerful editing tool set in Lightroom in great detail during my 4-week course After the Click. Now, when the ISO settings get really high though, even Lightroom struggles. Generally, I'm not bothered by a bit of noise in my images, but when the ISO climbs past 5 or 6 stops above your camera's base ISO, the game begins to change. So if your base ISO is 200, 6 stops beyond this means shooting at ISO 12,800. And this difference between 200 and 12,800 is the difference between going home with a usable image or going home empty-handed. So today, I'd like to show you a technique for greatly reducing the visible noise in these extremely high ISO images. So what is this magic technique? To begin with, it doesn't involve spending money on another expensive plugin or a standalone app. All you really need for this is something you likely already have, Photoshop. In fact, you don't even need Lightroom. Adobe Bridge and a Camera Raw will do just fine for this. Now, to use this technique, begin by choosing an ISO value that lets you shoot at a comfortable shutter speed for hand-holding the lens you're using. Put your camera's drive setting to high-speed continuous. Most cameras today are capable of shooting at least 5 to 8 frames per second, and many can do more. Frame up your image, hold your camera as steady as you can, and squeeze off 5 to 10 frames, all at the same exposure and ISO settings. Now, you'll need at least 5 frames for this to work. More is better, but 7 or so should be about right. For this demo, ISO 12,800 gave me a shutter speed of a 75th of a second at f2.8, just adequate for hand-holding the lens I was using. Once you're back home, move the images into either Lightroom or Camera Raw according to your normal workflow. I've chosen to use Lightroom for the purposes of this demonstration. Okay, so we have our images from our little blue hour shoot here. We've selected 9 images out of those that were shot. All of the same exposure and ISO, 75th of a second at f2.8, ISO 12,800. And if we zoom in here, you see we have some pretty significant noise to deal with. Now at this point, all we would want to do is to take care of some basic tone and color adjustments, whatever you think is necessary. 2 things we won't do at this point, cropping or horizon straightening. The other thing that we absolutely do not want to do is to apply any sharpening or noise reduction at this stage. So I've already gone ahead here and I've edited one of these images. I've turned off the sharpening, as you can see, and I've set some basic tone mapping and color adjustments. Also applied a little bit of color grading here just to put a bit of a magenta tint into the brighter areas. They tend to go a bit greenish because of the nature of the artificial light that's being used there. Also put a bit of a blue tint into the darker shadows that seem to be in keeping with the blue hour feeling of the image. Now that I've got these set here in this one particular image, I'm going to select the remainder in the sequence, and we're going to synchronize those settings across all. Make sure everything here is selected, then we simply click Synchronize, and these tone and color adjustments will now be applied across all the other images in our sequence. Now I do have a 10th image here, and we're going to come back to that one. So now that we have our 9 images selected from our sequence of shots taken at this moment, we're simply going to right click and we're going to edit in and open as layers in Photoshop. Okay, so we have all of our 9 images open as layers here in Photoshop. The first thing we need to do is ensure that all layers are perfectly aligned with one another. So we're going to select all of the layers by clicking the top layer here and holding down the Shift key, clicking the bottom layer, selecting everything in between. I'm going to go here to Edit, Auto Align Layers. The default of auto is fine for our purposes, so we click OK. And here again, this process will take a few seconds to a minute or so, depending upon the speed of your computer. Okay, so the process completed. All the layers are now perfectly aligned with one another. We did open up some white space because there are slight differences in framing and tilt between each of the layers. So we simply handle that by selecting the crop tool. And we're going to crop in here to make sure that we don't leave any of this white space around the outside edges. While we're at it here, I think we will also correct the tilted horizon that I managed to end up with. Hit enter. And there we are. So the layers remain selected, as you can see. And at this point, we're going to convert all of these layers into a single smart object. So we go to Layer, Smart Objects, Convert to Smart Object. And now the process is completed. It appears as though we have a single layer left, but in fact, all 9 layers are still represented within this compound smart object. Okay, now we're going to go back here and we're going to choose, once again, Smart Objects. Go down to Stack Mode. And this is where the noise reduction will happen. So the only 2 options that are meaningful to us here are either mean or median. Both are averaging algorithms. You can try either one in your own image and to see which one works best. I'm going to use median for this particular image. And we're done. And if we zoom in here, see that the noise that we had before is now greatly reduced. There's still a little bit present, but this is easily handled. At this point, we could save this image and do the sharpening and noise reduction back in Lightroom, or we can simply use the Camera Raw filter here in Photoshop. Now I'm going to use a high ISO sharpening and noise reduction approach, which I cover in detail in After the Click. For now, I'll simply run through the settings here, and there is our final result. So let's go back now into Lightroom and do a little comparison. So we can go here into reference mode. Here is our original image, which of course, as we recall, is very noisy. And here is our final, which I've returned from Photoshop. As you can see, the results are greatly improved. I find by using this technique, I end up with an image with noise characteristics similar to an image shot at 2 to 3 stops lower than what was actually used. So in this case, shooting at ISO 12800, I end up with an image that appears as though it was shot at ISO 1600 to 3200. Any remaining noise is easily handled in the detail panel of Lightroom or Camera Raw. But of course, there's no free lunch. This won't work with moving subjects, and despite our success here, the original image was still shot at a very high ISO. So very fine detail will likely be submerged in the noise of that original image, and you can't recover what isn't there to begin with. But for the majority of images you might choose to shoot this way, I think you will like the results. And lastly, saving the image in Photoshop with all layers intact will result in very large files. A stack of 10 images from a 24 megapixel camera will result in a file of about 2.5 gigabytes. Frankly though, once you have completed this process, there really isn't any reason to save the file with all the layers intact. Simply flatten the layers before saving the file to end up with much more reasonable file sizes. So I hope you found this interesting, and I hope you'll give it a try. If you'd like to learn more about sharpening and noise reduction, along with the rest of the powerful tool set in Lightroom or Camera Raw, perhaps you'll have a look at my course over on bpsop.com. And finally, if you did like this video, I'd be most appreciative if you would give it a like below and perhaps even subscribe to this channel. Thanks for watching.